Nighttime logic is the part or parts of the story that are often felt but not consciously processed. And it's also the name of our program today, as my fancy scrolling banner is reminding us, is Thursday, September 12th, 2024. I'm broadcasting here from New York. It's an autumn on the horizon night, and I'm here with Brian Evenson on his launch week for Good Night, Sleep Tight, out now from Coffee House Press. And now that's scrolling too. Welcome, Brian. How are you? Happy launch week for Good Night, Sleep Tight.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah. I welcome back to the program. It's always great to talk to you. I was going to read your biography for the uninitiated, but I also have a copy of None of You Shall Be Spared. So I'd like to read a couple of fantastic quotes about your work for those who may not have. Let's see. There is not a more intense, prolific, or apocalyptic writer of fiction in America than Brian Evenson. George Saunders. Like with Borges, Kafka, every one of Brian Evenson's stories are a whole world distilled down to a few pages and rendered in a pointillism that feels not just abstract but cosmic, yet is gritty and all the same leaves a distinct, bloody residue in your mind, in your heart, and then you can no longer look at the world the way you used to. And that's from Stephen Graham Jones. So some high praise, some well-earned praise from some great authors. And Good Night, Sleep Tight is no exception. I am not going to be shy about saying how much I love this book. This was great. So congratulations.
Thanks.
I appreciate it. Congratulations. I've been watching like other interviewers and other reviewers come down the pipe, and it's just been a great response to it. So how's the launch week been? You had a launch event, was that yesterday?
I had a launch event yesterday. I had on Sunday, I did a podcast, Greg Green's podcast with
I saw
Laird
that.
Barron.
Is that with Laird Barron?
Yeah, it was with Laird.
Laird's got a book out.
He does, Not a Speck of Light, which is a terrific book. Yeah.
Not a Speck of Light. Laird's going to be on the program. I don't have the date just yet, but Laird is great, and we love to support him as well. So happy launch week to the two of you.
And then I had last night, I did a physical launch at a bookstore, Skylight Books in Los Angeles, which was really fun. We had a good crowd.
Oh,
it was just a good time all around. My son Max, who's 11, came to hear me read. So and he kind of, he likes my stories, but he likes them a little bit because they feel, I think, a little like risky for him or something.
I'm so glad that you mentioned Max, as I forgot in preparing for this. I didn't get a chance to ask you, but there are a lot of we'll get into it, but there are a lot of stories about family or family units here. So I was like, I wasn't going to mention it, but I was just going to say, like, I don't know Max, but I only know Max from time to time. You will put up pretty humorous and insightful little pieces of your readings or your walkings with Max. So he just seems like such a special kid. But so he enjoyed himself. He got to feel like he was doing something a little naughty by hearing Dad's scary stories.
I think so. I mean, or he enjoys. He's really social. It's weird. He's a little more social than either my wife Kristen or me, and so he likes being kind of out in that environment, being around people, listening to things.
So he had a good time.
He had a great time. So.
Are there any curse words in your story that like maybe he like?
Well, so I read Good Night, Sleep Tight. There's not a curse word in that, I don't think. And so, but it's like a story about a young boy being frightened while he's going to street. I worried that it would have an effect on him, like when he tried to go to sleep that night. But he went to sleep just fine, so that's good.
I'm glad I had a banner to introduce myself. I'm your host, Daniel Braum. Welcome everyone, and these banners are okay. Yeah, they're keeping me honest. Yeah, I mentioned that I once did a book launch and a reading, and I had a young family member, my nephew, there, and as I started reading and realized how much cursing and how dark the subject matter was, I was squirming because I just saw him, like, his reaction was just like, what did I get into? But let's get right into it. There's so many. Let's start in the beginning there. I read this book in order, and
that's good. I really wrote it that way. I think a lot of my books can be read in any order, but I really think you gain something by reading it in that particular sequence. I hope.
I really did. I really, sometimes you don't feel that way about a book. The great Kelly Link has mentioned to me on more than one occasion that she not only reads stories starting from the end, like collection starting from the end, but sometimes she doesn't even read stories or novels sequentially, and was completely not even joking about that. But but this one I did read from the beginning, and so I think I mentioned to you in the sound check. So I'm trying to, I'm reading it both to enjoy it, but to prepare. I had one part of the mind that I'm going to get to speak to you about it. So I'm trying to figure it out. Like, okay, what is this book about? But so you said you actually wrote the stories in the order? Is that?
Oh, no. I arranged them in an order that I wanted them to be read. So yeah. No, they're definitely they were written in a different order. So.
I was going to say that would be remarkable.
Yeah.
But okay, so you sequenced them and you chose them. Okay, which is great because what I was struck to about the first two stories, the sequence, which I think we're going to hear from, and the cabin. So those two were very clearly, they're about the characters at some point are crossing over. I'm just going to say to another place. It's never really clear where they're crossing over, but there is some movement from here to somewhere else. So what is it about? And that's just something that reoccurs in one way or another throughout the book, throughout the stories. What is it that attracts you to that? What is it about that particular element that is such a recurring element in your stories in general and in this batch of stories?
Crossing over and moving to I think that there's something really interesting about just transitions and moving into different spaces. In a lot of the stories, as you mentioned, they're either they begin in a place that looks realistic and they kind of move to a place that looks like could be quite, it's very alien and strange. And then often when the characters come back to the realistic or real world, if they do come back, they don't always come back. Then that starts to feel strange too. So, I mean, I think what I'm interested in, I've been interested for a long time in just the way in which reality can feel like unstable or fractured. And one way to show that is kind of to reveal something underneath or hidden, or to suggest that something's there that, has just, been there the whole time, but people haven't been able to access or notice. So yeah, that's definitely a recurring theme for me, not only in this collection, but in a lot of my other work as well.
These two stories are, that really does sum up generically, what does happen. You're making it sound almost polite and nice, almost Narnia-like, and it's anything but that. Like, when reality, you're like, oh, it's strange or different. You're like, and absolutely mind-blowing for these characters as they start to realize that something's happening. It's like
if it's like Narnia, it's Narnia on really, really bad acid. That sort of thing.
Yeah, right. Real kind of maybe slow acting, and they're bad. Both of these stories have the people who cross over. There are entities there that I think part of why these stories are horror stories. In addition to, we can make a case that we could call them a lot of other things. Is that they face entities and encounters that are not benevolent.
Yeah.
What I say by that is the reader, part of the horror of it is that maybe these characters hold space that maybe they could be benevolent, maybe they're mistaken for benevolent, maybe the character is seeking it, but then there's sort of that feeling of like, oh no, there's always one key thing you deliver where you're like, no. And they don't, like you said, and they even come back at all. Tell me about the endings of these stories, because I'm so fascinated and so interested and so wowed by the structure of them. What's your thought on the endings of these two, and then on just endings that I'm seeing in this book?
Well, I think, so when I was younger, the thing that got pushed a lot, I'm just looking again at the endings of the stories to remind myself what I was doing. When I was younger, I
can refresh your memory on some of them.
Right. Yeah. When I was younger, the whole notion of Freytag's pyramid got pushed a lot in like writing classes I took and things like that.
I don't even know what that is. What is
it's just the idea that there's a structure of a story, which is kind of like climbing up a mountain, and then you have a climax, and then there's a denouement that goes down afterwards. And there's various moments on that, kind of pattern that the stories do. And I always kind of thought, when people were telling me it should be this way, first, I'm kind of contrary. So I tend to just, if people tell me that you have to do, if you have to do something a particular way, I just tend to do it another way.
Good advice.
Yeah. But they, I just kept on wondering, why do I have to have a denouement? Why do I have to end a story with everything kind of relaxing or coming back down again? Why can't I kind of just end at a moment of tension, or kind of reach a point where you think things are over and then suggest that something else is coming? And so both these stories,
well said.
Yeah, both these stories try to do that, where they don't really give you a place to rest at the end. You get a sense that you maybe have a brief moment of pause before something else really occurs, or before the story goes on in a different way. So yeah, a lot of my stories do that. They truncate. They kind of cut off the kind of neat ending, and try to put the reader in a position where they're thinking about what could happen, even after the story's done.
And that is, that's no small task. That's no small task, but it's also, it makes your stories really unique.
Oh, thank you.
It makes them really effective. I think so often, again, I never learned the Freytag, but it's that ending. It's your choice of ending does not offer what you might think of as a traditional resolution.
Yeah.
Not win or lose or the other way. I call it like it's often ending on a revelation.
Yeah.
Or a realization.
Yeah.
And by ending him there, as you said, you'd like to hope that it allows the reader to think about something, and it does just that, because and often the point that you let them realize is take that reader, or like, this happened, this might happen, this isn't going to happen. And often I'm laughing because these things are awful, or very uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And by truncating them, as you say, by not going on the other traditional points of the story, we're left with it, and we're left there. So it gives an additional focus in case you missed it.
Yeah.
The guy from the cabin, that guy's not there to help him, dear. Just in case you, because I think it's a reason why people might love or perhaps hate your stories, because some people are here for the roller coaster ride, to feel the thrill and then come back from it and be like, oh, but we vanquished evil.
Yeah.
We were in danger and now we're safe.
Yeah.
And that's you get the safe point from your stories.
Exactly. No, you don't. Yeah. So I am not that interested in giving a resolution. I think that's a good way to put it. I'm more interested in seeing what the story can open up within the reader, and that they can have to, continue to think about and continue to confront. I do think, with traditional horror, I was actually talking about this with Laird the other day, if I remember correctly, that there is this thing that traditional horror often does, where it's like there's the order of things. It's been disrupted. Terrible things are happening. Let's get back to stability. and especially with a certain kind of horror novel from the 80s, you get that as a kind of gesture. And I'm more interested in the disruption than this return to stability. I don't really find that part of it that interesting. So yeah, I mean, I'm more interested in thinking about, all right, I want the reader to have a kind of experience with my work, and part of that experience is putting them in a position where they have to kind of be involved in the story and help complete the story in some ways, where they continue to think about, where would this go after it ends. So yeah, hopefully, but I could see how for certain kinds of readers, it just would make them crazy.
Absolutely. But that was one of the, the several reasons why I think there's something special about this collection. It's a collection of stories that, you're feeling off balance on this because you're not gonna get that. There's a lot of things to think about, and they're often you don't get back to the point of safety.
No.
And there's a lot to think about. But before we get to exactly some of the more challenging and surprising in all the right ways things that you offer us to think about, let's keep to this initial set of stories. I think the next one sequentially is The Rider.
Yeah.
And I'll talk about The Rider because we'll use that to talk about titles. So here I am reading this book. We have the sequence, the cabin, and then The Rider came, and I'm like, oh, this is a great book, because at this point I've got, okay, there are these really deceptively simple titles, and then I noticed that structure, so I'm like, okay, I know where this ride is taking me, and I'm up for it. Let's talk about. Tell me about titles. What were you thinking about these titles before I try to tell you?
I mean, I think I've tended with titles generally to opt for things that are kind of define a space, but that are not too specific about the way in which they define it. I don't want to reveal that much in a title usually. I mean, every once in a while there'll be a title that's more elaborate, like there's a story in this collection called "It Does Not Do What You Think It Does." And you only kind of realize what the title means when you read the story. But that kind of the neutrality of those titles, like the sequence, I mean, it kind of defines a field for you in terms of what the story could be, but it doesn't define it very specifically. And so it kind of leaves things open, but also it's like a very large funnel that's bringing the reader into the story. And then you only realize what the sequence is after you've
all right, so I'm glad you qualified with that last little part there, because I'm like, okay, yeah, they are these. It's not quite. That's what's so deceptively simple and wonderful about these titles, is because they at first you're like, oh, these are just he's defining the space, but not defining the space, so you don't get it. But then once you read the story, you're like, oh, but Evenson. Referring to you in the third person, like he's doing it, like the Rider. Then once you read the Rider, you go back and you see the title, and you're like, oh, then it has another layer of meaning.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
And that was just fun. That was just fun, saying a fun thing about a very dark story about the Rider. Which the Rider brings up another really awful. I just say it awful because it's something.
Yeah,
something awful to me. Another awful theme, and that is, the loss of, perhaps, and the lack of physical bodily agency is something that happens in the Rider. How'd that find its way into your story and these stories?
Yeah. I mean, it's something that, I mean, it appears in several stories in different ways, but it's something that I've been really interested in for a long time. I think it has partly to do with me. So as you know, I've talked about this before. I'm an excommunicated Mormon, and so I was kind of raised in this particular religion that put a lot of emphasis on choice and making choices and agency and being responsible. And so in a kind of culture like that, the idea that you wouldn't be able to kind of act, that you wouldn't be able to choose, you wouldn't be able to make, move your body, and make it do what you wanted to do is one of the more horrifying things. So I think that comes partly from that for me. I think it also comes from when I was younger, I used to experience sleep paralysis, which is an awful thing. And yeah, that moment of waking up and not being able to move is something that's, if you've ever experienced it, is really hard to forget. So it's something.
Are you okay talking? Are you okay talking?
Sure. Yeah, I can talk about it. I mean, it's been a number of years since I've had that. It's for whatever reason, it was something that affected me many years ago, but hasn't seemed to have come back. Maybe because I just am more restless when I sleep now. I don't know. But yeah, I mean, it's a very strange experience and very unsettling. So yeah, for me, I mean, I think one of the worst things is the idea that you could be in a position where you weren't in control of your body and you weren't able to move.
Wow. Yeah, it just sounds like a real life horror, and we could derail all the stories by talking about that. I'm really interested in that. But before I decide if I'm going to go into some of those questions, how about before we launch into what I'm saying is another layer of this book, are you going to perhaps read for us from the
sequence? I'll read. Yeah, I'll read a little from the sequence and start with that, if that makes sense.
Okay.
So I'm not going to read from the very. I won't read from the very beginning of the story. What's that? Sorry.
Okay. I said I'm going to put you on the solo screen while you set it up, and we'll bring you back after you're done reading. So
okay, sounds good.
Brian Evenson reading from the sequence.
All right, so I'm not going to read from the very beginning of the story. This is a story about two young girls who are twins. One is named Sidra, and the other's named Celine. And I'll just read kind of from a few pages in. Basically, what's happening is one of the girls asks the other girl to kind of do a game with her, and it has kind of unexpected results. So the game began something like this. Sidra was gathering buttercups into a heap, and Celine was stirring an anthill slowly with a stick, when suddenly Celine stood up and said, "Do you want to play a game?" This confused Sidra a little. "But we're already playing games," she said. Celine made a little disgusted noise and brushed the hair out of her eyes. She was sweaty and dirty, but so was Sidra. They were always just as sweaty and dirty as each other. That was, Sidra felt, part of being a twin. "This isn't really a game," Celine said. She gestured at the stick poking out of the anthill, a stream now with confused ants. Then she gestured at the pile of wilted buttercups. "That isn't either." Ants had made their way into the flowers as well, Sidra saw, were swarming all over them. "These are the kinds of things people do when they can't think of a game." Sidra shrugged. "Okay, what do you want to play?" Celine stretched out her hand. "Come on," she said. "I'll show you." Her twin led her way from the anthill and the buttercups and across the lawn to where their grandfather's wheelchair was. He sat in it, slightly slouched, a parasol wired to the wheelchair's frame and unfurled above him. He was dressed to go out. Their mother always dressed him like that, even though she never took him anywhere. The only thing she did was roll him out of the house and park him in the yard. She would check on him every hour or two, charging the girls with letting her know if anything went wrong in the meantime. "Hi, Grandpa," said Celine to him, and Sidra echoed, "Hi, Grandpa." He didn't respond, or hardly did. Behind his greasy lensed glasses, he blinked. That was all he could ever manage. He had been paralyzed for as long as Sidra had been alive. She had asked her mother about it once, asked why he couldn't move, and her mother had sighed. "Nobody knows why," she'd said. One day her father had been walking and talking like normal, and then abruptly he collapsed. He hadn't moved since. "We're going to play a game, Grandpa," said Celine, and their grandfather blinked again. One blink. Probably means yes, or I understand, thought Sidra, if it means anything at all. Maybe it means nothing. "Is Grandpa playing too?" asked Sidra. Celine shook her head. "He's just the starting line," she said. Then she turned to their grandfather. "No offense," she told him. He blinked again. Celine looked at Sidra. "You need to do everything I do," she told her. "Exactly as I do it, in the exact same way." "Why?" That's the game, said Celine. Step where I step, exactly. Move like me too. It should be easy for you because we have the same size feet. If we weren't twins, probably only one of us could play. This confused Sidra, but she nodded. All right then, said Celine. Her face was creased, her gaze abstracted as if she was listening hard, trying to hear something far away. Let's begin. Her twin moved forward until the toe of one foot was touching the rubber of the wheelchair's wheel, her opposite hip knocking against her grandfather's knees. She sidestepped, clapped once, then stepped backward while sucking in a deep breath. All the while, their grandfather was blinking more rapidly than Sidra had ever seen him blink before. What did it mean? Her twin took another step, clapped, then peered back over her shoulder, encouraging Sidra to repeat the pattern. Sidra did. She moved toward her grandfather until the toe of her shoe touched the wheel. That close to her grandfather, pressed against his leg, she could smell his body. She did not care for the sour smell of him. But despite that, she concentrated on doing everything her twin had done and doing it all exactly right. That was the game, after all. Good, murmured Celine, and began another sequence. This time, Sidra followed her closely, staying only a step or two behind, putting her feet into the impression Celine's feet had left in the grass before they could disappear. And this time, with this new sequence, Sidra felt something had begun to change. Not something she could see exactly, more something she could sense. The air seemed stiller than elsewhere on the lawn, and the light was becoming different too. This scared Sidra a little, but since Celine kept moving forward, Sidra did too. Sidra had been born second, and ever since she had always followed behind Celine. They turned right and took a few dozen steps, touching the toe of one step to the heel of the next, picking a quiet, gapless line across the lawn. There was their grandfather to one side, a little way away now. It looked to Sidra as if a pane of dirty glass now lay between them and him, leaching him of color. And then Celine stepped sideways, and suddenly the hum of insects, the sighing of the gentle breeze, the chirping of birds all vanished. Sidra couldn't hear any more of it, couldn't even hear her sister's footsteps. In front of her, she saw her sister clap her hands together in the air, but Sidra couldn't hear that either. She could feel it, though, could almost see the soundless sound ripple out through the air toward her. She could see the air shiver, and for just a moment a transparent wall became vaguely visible beside her, and then the shiver stopped and the wall faded away, becoming invisible again, or nearly so. Perhaps that was what was making their grandfather seem drained of color. The house, too, had faded, felt less present, less real. Suddenly, Sidra began to be afraid of where her sister was taking her. And we'll stop there.
That's from the sequence. Well done. Great story.
Thank you.
If you're just joining us, it's one of a few of the stories from the beginning of Good Night, Sleep Tight, which is out now from Coffee House Press. And so as I'm reading, I've read 3 or 4 of the stories at this point in my reading. I'm like, okay, I know what this book's about. We've got lack of agency crossing over, loss of control, and then we get the next 2 stories. And it's so hard to pick a favorite story because I love so many of these stories. But the next 2 stories are called The Annex and Untitled, parentheses, Cloud of Blood. We're going to take these one at a time.
Okay, yeah.
Just when I think I know what Brian is doing in these stories, we get this really fascinating story called Annex. And I'll just read a little bit of what I posed some questions to Brian for a written interview we're doing. And so first, I think it's just simply a really fascinating twist on these themes. And he's like, because this is it's what you might call a science fiction story, because we're not on planet Earth. Dorothy, Toto, we are clearly not on planet Earth anymore, and our main character is not a human. We don't know. It's not names, but in today's world, we might think of it as an AI or a sentient robot, and we're clearly getting this story with a tight point of view with the sensations and observations of this non-human entity. And then I'm like, oh, okay, Brian is giving us these same themes, but in space, which is it's a lot. So I'm saying that because there's a lot more than that happening here, a lot. But that is happening. So at first I'm like, oh wow, like he's really committed to these themes, and like it's just fascinating in itself to see perhaps a horror story of what is horror to a non-human entity. Is it the same things that would be horrific to human, or is there an extra? Is Brian trying to figure out what could what could be awful to these things? So it makes a great just on that level, and there's a lot more levels delivered. It makes a great juxtaposition to the stories. But there's this mystery going on. So, and even though we get these heady themes, I just have to tell everyone, in case you're like, oh wow, that's too heady or whatever, these stories flow. You know, like a story, before it can do anything else, it has to flow, it has to entertain. And Annex just entertains you just on the face value of it, because it's this mystery of what happens to this robot. And he, of course, discovers this very complicated room, or a special room called, I guess it's an annex. And if it's okay, I want to read a couple of lines before posing
absolutely.
So he encounters another head of his own there, and he's having, after a bunch of things happen, he gets into it with his other head. This must be very strange for you, my other head said. What are you? I asked. On you, it said. But I'm me, I said. Yes, my other head said patiently. That is also true. How can both be true? My other head fixed its upper quadrant in a way I interpreted as disinterest. At least I thought that is how I would express disinterest if I had no body. If the head is also me, is it right to expect it to do the same as I would do? What makes you think there should be only one of you? My other head said. So, you know, delivering moments like that are, you know, exactly that sort of thing that you were saying in the beginning of our conversation. It's really, you're adding to the list of challenging the notions of what is self and what is existence. And while it's fun for us, that may or may not be a very pleasant thing to contemplate. Do you find it more of a sense of wonder, or more of a sense of horror, or both, contemplating these sort of notions?
I mean, I think it's a little bit of both. It was really interesting to me. I mean, when you said at the beginning, you said you're not on Earth anymore, Dorothy and Toto, because the story was actually inspired by one of the Oz books that I was reading with my son. And there's a moment in one of the late Oz books where the Tin Woodsman finds parts of his old body, and they have a weird conversation, or parts of his old body, and it's such a strange, bizarre moment. And it just, the story is quite different from this, but that kind of was the moment of generation. But yeah, I mean, for me, it's partly, there's a kind of horror to it. There's something really interesting to me, though, too, about just thinking about, how would beings who are very different from us think? How would they interact? How would they propagate? How would they kind of send themselves in the future, since they don't necessarily breed in the same way that we do? And all those questions, I mean, they come up in Annex. They obviously come up in other stories in the collection. And then I published on Tor.com a little series of short pieces called After the Animal Flesh Beings. And those are all these, they're these kinds of post-human, non-human kind of artificial beings who are existing far after humanity has died out, and are just telling kind of legends and fairy tales about humans.
Wow. Are those still up on Tor.com?
Yeah, they are. They should still be up on Tor.com.
Wow.
Yeah.
So before I ask too much about that, Annex, one of the wonderful things about Annex is we do come back to this setting in the book.
Yeah.
There's a series of stories that I forgot what I called them, but reading the story notes, Annex and some other stories were first published, if I'm not mistaken, a few years ago, back in 2021. Were these what I'm calling the Rafis? Do I have it right? Rafis Press?
Yeah, Rafis Press. Yeah, really interesting Brazilian press. Yeah, that would publish fine press editions, just like a story. And there'd be English and Portuguese. There'd be the English original and Portuguese translation, and they're just beautiful little books. Yeah.
And these are like ultra limited editions, if I'm not mistaken. Before Good Night, Sleep Tight, were these only available in these 35, 50 runs? Published in Brazil?
Yeah, somewhere. So I think Annex was actually, I published it there, and then he allowed me to kind of republish it in a magazine in the US. But yeah, some of them, there's several stories in this book.
There's a group of them.
Yeah, that were only published over there.
I mean, that's just fascinating and enjoyable just on that level as well. Did Rafis know what they were getting? So did they know? Did they know they were getting these sort of loosely but thematically linked science fictional stories about self and propagation of non-human entities?
I can't remember how it came about that they decided to publish me. I think the first story they did was the story Mother, which is also in the book, and I think that it may be actually. I think I blurbed I don't know what happened, but I either bought some books from them or blurbed it, and he mentioned that he was interested in doing something, and I sent him something. I was like, this may or may not be something that works for you, and he was very into it. And then eventually we started doing a kind of series of these stories. So there's a series of these stories we've done. We've done also some stories that I call the Lancaster stories. I think there's 2 of those that we've done. And those are all kind of set in this weird space called Lancaster that doesn't really exist in the world. But yeah, so we have the kind of non-human.
Lancaster, those are not in Good Night, Sleep Tight, are they?
No, there may be one in the other book you showed at the beginning. Okay. I'm not positive. I can't remember if it was in there or not, but yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, there's a lot to chew on in these Rafis Press stories, and I'm going to come back to them. So we'll let the reader, we're doing this pretend read along, for those watching tonight. So, doing Brian just sent me a link, which I'll be able to share of, I think some of the stories we're talking about. Another story I'm really fond of is Untitled, Cloud of Blood. So again, not spoiling, but it's another one of those simple. It's such an interesting title because you're like, oh, Untitled, but then you give us a title, right? So it's like Untitled. So I'm thinking of it. Oh, is it one of these simple non-definitional things? But then you do give us a title in the parentheses. But it all makes sense because the title of the story is also the name of a painting which this story is about. So it's got this whole meta thing going on, but then it also is such a fascinating horror or just a fascinating story. So it's a cursed object story in a way. Yeah. I just had Paul Tremblay on the show. Have you read Horror Story yet?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So Paul and I were talking about cursed objects. So this is a cursed object story. It's a cursed painting, but is it a cursed object story? It seems to be that if you touch this painting, so the narrator is pretty sure or is operating with, and thus we, the reader, are, that if you touch this painting, or the people who touch the painting will eventually commit suicide. So if this is true, and then the reason I say that is that there's this level of there's not a level of resolution, there's not a level of certainty, and that just makes me love it. That just makes me love it more. I think it would be super cool if it was a cursed object story, like presented as such, like the beginning. Dear reader, once upon a time there was a cursed object, but it's not presented that way at all. So it made me think of a lot of non-human. Again, like juxtaposed with Annex, it made me think of the non-human, but it's such a different orbital way. It made me think of stories that are non-human, and I think of the monkey's paw, the classic story. I think of Some Zombie Contingency Plans by Kelly Link, which is also a painting. It's very deceptively named. It's not a zombie story at all. I think of Heart Shaped Box by Joe Hill. So these are the kind of stories where, in addition to just being great stories, they're stories where the non-human thing is really the center of the story and probably has a whole life and story before the humans, and probably has a whole life and story after the humans. So what was the appeal to this sort of structure, or this sort of object in the story for you?
I love kind of cursed object stories. That's something I'm interested in, but also like there's something about this where it seems like it may be more than an object. This kind of slipperiness between an object and an entity is something that just really intrigues me. I mean, these things that exist where, you can't exactly define where they're located. And then also the weight of this artwork that has been in this narrator's life for pretty much as long as he can remember, and that he's become convinced is, doing something to everybody who's around him, and is really convinced by the end of the story that he's next. That and what's going to happen may have already happened in a way. So it's I mean, I think it's an intriguing thing. I tried to do a different take on that. I wrote that story. Steve Shaw, who runs Black Shuck Books, does this annual anthology in which it's all British writers, but he always invites one American writer, and I was the one American writer. And so I felt like, since I was the one American writer, but it was a British anthology, I should set my story in the UK. And
it was set in the UK. Okay, there was so much I didn't even quite. It makes sense that it would be set in the UK. There is a certain formalism to it, but I like Black Shuck Books. They're great. They always do really interesting work coming out of the UK there. I didn't realize I was in an anthology. There's called Pareidolia. I'm going to show my power of mispronunciation. Pareidolia.
And I was in that too. So I think that was not one that was. It's I can't remember the name of the series, but they have a once a year series they do. They have a great great British horror, or great British horror authors. I know the series. I think I've read at least one or two of there. But getting back to Untitled Cloud of Blood, I'm oversimplifying by saying cursed object. So I like that you mentioned two things about it. You said, it may or may not even be an object, like it's this thing, and it just jarred my memory. There is a sequence in the story where the main character he's either touching or fussing over the frame or the border of it, and that just has a nice resonance about borders and framing and existence. And then you said, just the emotional weight of it. There's it's so much more than what you might think of as like, like I will help you carry the ring, Frodo, even though that I love the Lord of the Rings so much. But there is an emotional weight to this because of what it means to him, which just makes for a fantastic recipe. So you mentioned the story
you mentioned the story Mother.
Mm-hmm.
It's wow, it's such an ambitious story. There's so many layers to it. Was that the first one of what I'm calling this sequence of stories?
Yeah, that was the first story. And I mean, it really was. I mean, I ended up writing that story after I'd been reading Gene Wolfe, and there was something about
Okay.
his work that really. I mean, I love his work. He's someone I always return to. But for whatever reason, I mean, it sparked something, and kind of allowed me to approach that story in a slightly different way than I might have done otherwise. And and so wrote the story. I felt like it worked in the way I wanted it to, and was excited about it. And then it just opened up kind of ways of thinking about this topic with other kind of science fiction, artificial human stories. So there a lot of them are about artificial humans who are sometimes acting like humans or taking on human roles, and trying to figure out who they are, what relationship they have to the beings around them, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, and that is a really concise and really simple way of putting it for such a layered. One of the joys of reading the story is the way that these revelations unfurl. I want to read a really short, but yeah, there's one of these moments that was just a moment for me where I'm like, wow, this is fascinating. Like the main character in this story, at some point when he reaches this new level of understanding, we see just how different it is for them. Okay, have you seen Alien Romulus yet?
I have not seen Alien Romulus yet. I need to, but I haven't done it.
Okay. Without even going into that, there's just a scene in. Okay, taking Alien Romulus off the tip. Sometimes in films or things, we see an AI or a robot, and like Commander Data from Enterprise, he gets a chip, he puts the chip on. Oh, I have emotions now, or I'm a robot, I get the chip. You have something new. That is explored in such a fascinating way for me in Mother. At some point, this main character gets information, and here's this line that's just such an amazing line. It was knowledge that felt utterly new, and at the same time, strangely familiar. It was not that I recognized that I had once known it, but only that there was a blank space in my mind that seemed to fit the information exactly. A blank space I had not known existed until I felt it being neatly filled. And that really hold on one second, if you don't mind. Oh, I didn't want to do that. For the first time, I had to actually ban someone from our chat who is not behaving nicely. I never had that before. So we're like the androids and mothers, we're in new ground here. But getting back to Mother, I love wow, do I love that little passage right there, because what and I'm going to play devil's advocate against myself, but it seems incredibly a non-human thing. It seemed to show learning and also a fear and a horror. Like, wow, like this creature, this android is like, wow, I got the sense that I might have known this before, or I may have had that, which sort of has resonance with this notion of self and other iterations of self, which comes into play.
Yeah.
So that is the non-human aspect of it. Yet there still is something human about it, where you may be describing something, and that's not the point of the story, where maybe there are some times in our life where we humans feel that way when something happens.
Yeah.
And so it's one of those like trend, but maybe it's not what you call a mainstream, or it's not like it's at least not a common, it's not a very common human experience of feeling that. So, but I didn't even think that it might even be human until I was talking in absolutes. I said, that's such a non-human thing to feel. And then I thought, oh, but maybe there are some points in our humanity where we might. So it really starts to open up. You mentioned Gene Wolfe, who I'm familiar with him, but I haven't read much in Gene Wolfe. I'm thinking of the film Ex Machina. I'm thinking of Sailing to Byzantine by Robert Silverberg.
Yeah.
So Mother really opens up and it just starts speculating on transhumanism.
Yeah, I mean, Ex Machina.
It's the wonder and horror of that.
I mean, Ex Machina is a movie that's interesting to me, and this is not the notion of what it means to be transhuman or an artificial human or non-human is something that science fiction's been investigating and for a long time. So it's nice to I feel like I'm kind of trying to create a space for myself in an area that, like a lot of writers and other people before me, have kind of made a field that allows me to kind of come in a different way.
Yeah, there's so much to say about them. We're getting late in the hour. We're not going to wrap up just yet, but I wanted to ask you before we run out of time. Do you want to read from another selection?
Yeah. I'd be happy to.
Over to you. Let me set it up.
Yeah. So I'm going to read from the title story, which is called Good Night, Sleep Tight. And this time I'm going to start from the beginning and go forward from there. So there is a saying his mother had told him several times just before sleep when he was still quite young: always 3 graves. She had taken the saying from a book he discovered years later in college. The same book, as it turned out, from which she had taken many of the stories that, late at night, she had told him to frighten him. Even once he learned that, they still frightened him. Why 3? He asked her that first time. She shrugged. 1 for the father, she said. His own father at the time was already gone, buried. 1 for the mother, and, well, she seemed reluctant to go on. She had been, he now guessed, with the perspective of several additional decades, pretending this reluctance, but he hadn't known this at the time. Tell me, he forced himself to say, though he dreaded what he might hear. But wouldn't hearing it be better than imagining it? She shook her head slowly. I've already said too much, she claimed. And then she turned off the light and left the room, leaving him alone in the darkness. Later, once he had a child of his own, he wondered why his mother had terrified him so when he himself was just a child. He would never do something like that to his own son. No sane parent would. Was his mother not sane? Was that the problem? Or was she simply cruel? And why was she like that only at night, and not even every night? During the day, she was kind, loving. Most nights she was this too. Only 1 night in 20 would she terrify him. It was, if he was asked what on the whole his childhood had been like, he wouldn't hesitate to say, happy. Seen in that light, what harm really had been done to him? He had turned out all right, had had a few frightened nights, but ultimately this had had little effect on him. He wasn't traumatized. He didn't need a therapist. He lived what, by all outward appearances, was an implacably normal life. He was, true, still afraid of the dark, but even that was hardly an issue. Anything to disrupt the dark, even the blue dot on the wireless router across the room and beneath the desk, was enough to allay his fear. It was never a problem. His fear was always in check. Or rather, it had only been a problem once, years ago, when he and his wife had first bought the house they lived in now, and there was a power outage. He had woken up in the pitch dark, not knowing where he was, and feeling he was back in his childhood room again, in that same dark, having just been told another awful story, this one about a man who accidentally drank a ghost. He must have gasped or made an exclamation of some kind. Before he knew it, his wife was awake beside him and was touching his side, which made him gasp again. He heard himself this time. And then she spoke. Are you okay, honey? She said. Or, sweetie, what's wrong? He couldn't remember which now. Hearing her voice, he knew where he was, and his panic began to subside. A moment later, there was a beep, and the blue light of the router came on again, and everything was fine. The strange thing, it seemed to him thinking about it years later, was that she tried to scare me at all. She never did during the day, never even said boo to him, was never anything but kind. So why at night? Not every night either, not 1 night in 10. There was no real regularity, so he could never predict when it might be coming. No matter the night, she would come in first and read to him. Nothing scary, just a normal kid's book pulled from his shelves. She would read to him and then tuck him in, kiss his forehead, and leave the room. She would turn off the light on the way out the door. But on those nights when she was going to frighten him, even though she flicked the switch down as usual, the light somehow stayed on. He did not know how this could be. He had tried to make the switch do that himself, but never could. And she always acted, too, like the light had gone off properly, as if she believed herself to be leaving him in darkness. "Good night," she said, "sleep tight," and closed the door. But a few minutes later, the door would slide open again, and she would come back in, taking her place in the chair beside the bed without a word. She would remain like that for a moment, silent, hands resting lightly on her knees, and then turn to look at him. "Do you want to hear a scary story?" she would say. And then, whether he said yes or no or nothing at all, she would tell him one. What made her come back? Why did she return some nights but not most nights? He wasn't sure. There was no reason that he could make out. She just did. He asked his mother about it once when he was older, when he was in college, before he met his wife-to-be, and long before his son was born. The two of them were in the living room she generally reserved for company, but now that he was away at college, he qualified, he supposed, as company. In a lull in her recitation of neighborhood gossip, he had asked, "Why did you used to tell me those scary stories?" She gave him a strange look, as if genuinely surprised. At first, he read it to be surprised that he would mention during the day what they never acknowledged except at night. But then she said, "What scary stories?" "You know," he said, "at night." She made a little noise of disgust. "I've never told you scary stories," she said. But she had, he insisted. He went on to explain how she had left the room and then come silently back in shortly after. "What nonsense," she said. "Once I left, I never came back in. Why would I?" "But you did," he insisted. She shook her head. "You must have dreamed it," she said. He hadn't dreamed it. He was sure he hadn't. Why would she lie? He wondered, once back in his dorm room. Shame, perhaps? Or perhaps she genuinely didn't remember. He lay on his bed, staring up at the flaking acoustic tiles. On the other side of the room, he could hear his roommate talking to himself as he tried to complete his chemistry homework, mumbling scraps of formula. Or maybe, he thought, even at the time, she didn't know she was doing it. One story she told was about a creature that looked human but wasn't. Mostly it couldn't be distinguished from a human, but it was, so she said, capable of enormous self-distortion. To him, very young, the phrase sounded like a spell. It was capable, for instance, his mother said, of growing as tall as the ceiling, and then across it, and then lengthening itself down the wall. You can walk into a room only to find it behind you and above you and before you all at once. The worst thing to do is notice it. If you notice it, well, what choice does it have but to fall all around you and do away with you? She gave him a smile, or half her mouth did anyway. The other half tried to smile but failed. "Good night," she said, and turned off the light and left him alone in the dark. And I think I'll stop there.
Wow. I'm remembering remembering the story. So the first question, before I get to the question I just thought of, is, so why did you choose this as a title story?
I chose it as the title story because I felt like it brought together a lot of stuff that is in the collection in different ways. So there's stuff with relationships between parents and children that's throughout a lot of these stories. There's a kind of horror thread, which is something that's in most of the stories, maybe not all of them, but the majority of the stories, even the science fiction stories, seem to have at least some of that. And then that's also about storytelling. And so I thought, titling it with a book of a title that kind of, well, a story that refers to storytelling is nice for a collection of stories. The amazing thing was when it was first listed on Amazon, there's another book called Good Night, Sleep Tight that is for kids was on Amazon. And however the algorithm did it, ended up linking it to that book. So the hardcover was this kid's book, and so if you went and you looked on the link, it said, my wife reads this to our grandson almost every night.
So and you didn't even have to pay extra for the delight of having
no I didn't. So,
yeah, it's a great title story. I love how it, as you said, it touches on a lot of the different themes of the book. I love that I didn't think of. I read the story once. This is the second time I'm hearing that part. The worst thing to do is to notice it, because at that point, what choice do you have? So let me ask you a question. And obviously, it's kind of too late to give spoiler warnings for these entire stories that we've talked about. But one of the things that's great or different about this story is it might be the one outlier that is different structurally, in that I found this story to maybe be the one story that does offer a definitive ending. And excuse my curse words here, but the definitive ending, where most of the stories is like, yeah, reader, the main character is probably fucked. This story is, you actually get a confirmation of the fears. What I'm saying by that is the story makes much ado about the ambiguity, as you put out that thing in that reading. What do you mean? What do you mean the stories I read you? So there's really this ambiguity about whether the narrator experienced hearing his mom do that or not, whether it was childhood fears or imaginings or not. But at the very end of the story, there's a confirmation that no, or yes, there's another entity besides his mom, and it has resonance to what his mom or the doppelganger said, which you just read. So at that point, when what the worst thing to do is notice it. At that point in the story, is that his mom or is that the doppelganger? Or
I'm not going to tell you.
Okay, because it's great. Like, as I was reading that right there, I was like, "Damn! Oh my god!" Like, either way, it's so you do wind up with ambiguity. I'm like, finally,
there's a little ambiguity. I mean, there's not a ton, but yeah, it's. I mean, I think the ambiguity is more about what happens next. You know.
Yeah. And I didn't recall, like, it's a chilling ending when it does have a confirmation that there clearly is something not his mother, but it's such a subtle but effective foreshadow by hearing that story. It'd be like, well, if you notice it, and if you actually do figure it out, well, what choice does it have but to kill you? And that is very on point as to structure of the story. So we give you the pass in that you stayed within the lines of your own wonderful
just barely
rules that you set up for yourself. But that's a good point. We'll get ready to wrap it up here. That's a good point as any to wrap it up. There's so many other great stories in this book. There's so many other questions I want to ask you, but before we wrap it up, let me just final question is we'll just want to ask what's next, but I just want to give a shout out to a couple of the friends of the podcast. One of them is Horror from the High Desert. It's Horror from the High Desert. I think I've flubbed that a couple of times, which prompted my scrolling. So please check out author Scotty Milder's podcast and some great guests that he has coming up. Another podcast I wanted to mention, and I hope I have the name right, is Writing and Editing, or it might simply be called Writing and Editing, or maybe it's the Writing and Editing Podcast. It's a podcast hosted by Janina De Lima, and it's an excellent resource for would-be and already published authors. And there's the link where you can catch up with it there. Coming up next for Nighttime Logic is, I believe we are back October the 15th, 2024, and we'll be talking about Ian Rogers' new novel from Cemetery Dance, which is called Sycamore. So cool. We're looking forward to that. Yeah. What's next for you, Brian? Or
Well, so I finished a sequel to a novel I wrote called Last Days, and so that'll be the next thing out. It's a book called Phantom Limb, and that won't be out for a while since this book was just published, a couple days ago. It'll probably be 2026, early 2026 before that comes out.
Oh, congratulations on that. Well, Brian, stay with us while we sign out. We'll say a thank you again to our listeners who joined us. And
I'll say thank you. Yes.
It's Good Night, Sleep Tight is the name of the book. Thank you so much for being here, Brian. Thank you too.
Thank you. My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Have a great time.